So welcome to the third talk in our series, Design History Now. And this is a series that's going to continue to run throughout this year. Before I introduce Suchitra, I'll take a brief moment to once again contextualize the talk within the series as a whole. And I'd point you back to the recording of the first talk by our first speaker, Kamya Sharma, for a kind of longer introduction to the sort of thinking behind the series. So as we've sort of sketched out before, the series, the title of the series is Design History Now, and that's alluding to design history as a practice rather than as a singular narrative of the past. We're interested in exploring with you through the series what the practice of design history encompasses and should encompass now and in the future. We've set out that part of our intention with the series is to challenge a focus within some design history on a particular set of famous designers, on prominent art and design institutions, and on a narrow design canon. And we've suggested that this narrow focus risks pointing towards a singular design history rather than plural design histories, placing these players, sort of individuals and institutions, at the center of change. In moving away from this narrow focus, we've suggested considering design as consequence, framing what we might understand as design within larger social and political contexts, viewing design as an arbiter of history rather than the maker of it. But we've also noted that what constitutes design is itself a point of enquiry. To sort of partially quote design scholar Mahmoud Keshavaz, who's been really sort of influential in our thinking, we're interested in who is called a designer, who is qualified to talk about design, who understands the language of design, and who is allowed to expand its vocabulary, who is making constructive criticism, and who is foreign to it. These are questions that open up an understanding of design and its history in sort of challenging and we think really important ways, and pulls at the lines between design and the seemingly separate spheres of labor, production, technology, craft, just to name a few. And this makes us think more deeply about why we might want to draw these lines in the first place. Given what we've said about refocusing our lens away from individuals, if you've read the synopsis of this talk, you might be curious about the focus of this talk on an individual block carver. And I really believe that Suchitra's work that we're about to engage with, and more broadly her own self-reflective and critical research practice, will actually kind of explode and explore these questions in a number of really interesting ways. So I, for one, am really looking forward to this talk. I've been really looking forward to this talk for a few months, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share Suchitra's recent work. Suchitra Balasubrahmanyan studied visual communication at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and is visiting professor at Nehru University. Her research interests center on 19th and 20th century craft and design in India against the backdrop of decolonization and nationalism. Her recent publications, and I think these give you a really excellent sense of the sort of scope of Suchitra's work. These include Concrete Designs for Living, proposed by Marg magazine, The Materiality and Political Economy of Modernism in India in the Early Years After Independence. And that was last year. In 2021, the India-Pakistan border as a site for the production of national identity, heritage by design, and in 2019, moving away from Bauhaus and Ulm, which she wrote for the Moving Away edition of Bauhaus Imaginista, and for which she was a curatorial advisor. And so with that, I'd like to invite Suchitra up onto the stage, and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you all for coming in, braving the Bangalore traffic this evening. I just need to start with some thanks to Nina and Adarsh for putting this series together and for BIC for hosting this event. I will be sharing with you some glimpses into the archives of Maneklal Gajjar, who was a block carver for textile printing, as this visual shows. The archives are held by Mala and Pradeep Sinha in their studio workshop Bodhi in Baroda, and research into these materials was made possible by a grant from the India Foundation for the Arts under their arts research program, which was supported by the Parijat Foundation. So I'm grateful to IFA and Parijat Foundation for making it possible for me to present this work to you. My colleague in the project was textile designer Mala Sinha, and her insights into the textile design and production process has greatly informed my understanding of Maneklal's life and work. But any gaps that you see over here in what I'm able to show you today are my own. So the premise of this work was that we have a lot of work on the crafts of India. Some of them are encyclopedic in their surveys, some are regional in their focus, and some focus on a particular craft in specific. And I think you know about these kinds of books. These books have documented the diversity of craft in India, the techniques, technologies, materials, processes, and speculate on their histories and antiquity. There is a genealogy of this kind of work which dates back to colonial times, when British administrators initiated a kind of scholarship, this kind of scholarship that has become a genre in order to map the economic value of Indian craft to the imperial exchequer. After independence, the focus turned to rescue and revival with the intention of finding a place for hand manufacture in industrializing India, feeding into the developing discourse on national identity and heritage in the midst of rapid transformation. So I believe this is how the discourse on craft has been crafted, if you might say that, in the years after independence. And the crafted object has always been the center of attention, and all the focus on materials and processes and people, craftsmen, is to explain the arrival of the object. And we don't really have a granular account of a craftsman's life, their inner creative world, what they thought about their work, and the tradition that they were part of, or their place in a changing world. So Maneklal Gajjar's archives gives us the chance to open up this space and try to look at a single person's life against the backdrop on this discourse that we have internalized and almost normalized. And I was transformed by the archives, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you and hearing your reactions to it, because I think you will find it quite revealing in different kinds of ways. So this was Maneklal Gajjar. As you can see, he was born in 1928 and he died just about 10 years ago. So he's very much of our times. And this gives you an idea, a little bit of what he looked like. He was a very tall man. He was almost 6 feet tall and a very, very attractive figure. And I say this also to make him kind of real for all of us in the room today. This is the form in which we received the archives. When he passed away, his daughters turned to Mala, who had met him as a student at the National Institute of Design, and asked her to take care of their father's materials. And so it was stored like this in two Godrej almaris. And the material which you see in those shopping bags and plastic folders came stored in issues of Soviet Nari and Soviet Desh. These were Cold War propaganda magazines, but he used them as storage because they were these large format magazines with art paper, and they afforded very safe kind of storage for his prints, which I will just show you. Maneklal was a conscientious record keeper and has left behind a rich archive in the form of prints of his designs on paper, correspondence with clients, letters to and from craftspersons, books of accounts and photographs. I give you an account of all these materials because I'll be able to show you some glimpses, and I would like to also explain why I'm using the word modern man when I'm trying to describe him in this talk. So what is modern, and you can tell me if you think it's the right word, because he moves away, makes us move, compels us to move away from the pictures of crafts and craftsmen in the kinds of materials that we find in his archive. And the material is a rich resource for filling a significant lacuna in our understanding of the world of craft manufacture, the absence of a detailed account of the daily life, social world, economic ebbs and flows, and creative impulse of a craftsperson, along with an understanding of the way the individual craftsperson negotiated the politics of patronage and prestige that was ever present. They also point to this entangled relationship between craft and design, and you'll see that emerging as I go through the images. A little bit of context, just the geographical setting. You can see a little smudge to the right of Gandhinagar. That's the small village of Pethapur. It's about 5 kilometers from Gandhinagar. And to the left is the large metropolis of Ahmedabad. All three are on the banks of the Sabarmati, which is very important to the fact that the block carving is related to block printing, for which the river is a very important resource. The water is needed. So that is also some connection that you can make. Pethapur was established in the 10th century or so. Block makers are supposed to have, believed to have settled there in the 18th century. It was well known for exporting printed fabrics to Thailand. So it is a node in the global trade of Indian fabrics. There was a Gujarati school which was established in 1922, and Maneklal goes to the school and studies till the 7th standard, after which he drops out and joins his father and grandfather in the block carving business. So I now stop using the word tradition because of the many different ways in which it is loaded, and switch instead to the word inheritances, which helps us kind of understand what all it is that Maneklal learns from being part of the Gajjar community, which is the community of carpenters. So it indicates the Suthar caste of carpenters, and what all are they making. So the carpenter caste is making boats, chariots, homes and temples. He himself lived in a wooden home. Bird feeders, interior details like doors, windows, beds, cupboards, and agricultural implements like plows and other smaller items. All of these were also ornamented with carving. A few of them carved textile blocks. So that kind of places Maneklal in the larger expertise and the expert world of the carpenter caste. It's also a caste that modernizes by the end of the 19th century, and you can see that by Pethapur, which was known for 5 Bs. So Bangdi, that's bangles, banduk, guns, Biba, which is blocks, Bidis, which are, Bidis which we smoke, and Bandhni. And added to this in the late 19th century are bobbins, because the textile industry grows in Ahmedabad, and they switch to making wooden parts for industrial use. So he also belongs to a caste. So if we talk about traditions, we also have these kinds of inherited traditions. One, a node and a management of being in the trade of export fabrics, like the trade to Thailand. You are also part of industrializing Western India. You know how to keep the accounts and financial flows which is necessary for these kinds of enterprises. These are the inheritances which you'll see how he deploys them in his life as a Craftsman. These are the Saudagiri textiles which were made for export to Thailand. It's called Siam, so a lot of the literature on this material, you'll be finding the reference to Siam. You can see the Thai script in between the motif. These are the sample books from Maneklal's collection, and these were the fine kind of blocks on the top. The image on the top, you can see top left, is the fine field which was printed, and the bottom black outlines show you the borders. And the printed fabric looked something like this. The orders came from Siam, the designs came from Siam. They were blocks were carved in Pethapur. They were sent to Ahmedabad for printing and exported out of Surat. This is around the mid 19th century. So this is the Muscati family, was a family which was based in Surat, and they ordered a lot of these blocks from Maneklal's grandfather. Another set of inheritances that Maneklal has is that his grandfather was the official carpenter to the Empress of Ethiopia. So if you imagine Gujarat in the Arabian Sea, you can see that left of Gujarat is Ethiopia, and they traveled across the sea and did carpentry work for the royalty and noblemen of the Ethiopian court. So this is another kind of international inheritance that he has. So when we speak about tradition, we need to take all this into account. So just some examples, the lower dhoti-like garment that these figures on the right-hand side are wearing, that is the Saudagiri textile, which with fine print. Okay. By 1975, Maneklal blocks are collected at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. You can see that they've collected a Saudagiri block. I think by now you'll be able to recognize that kind of print. Just to say that in 66, he branches out and makes an independent professional practice. He leaves his father and grandfather's practice and sets up his own workshop. By 62, the National Institute of Design is set up in Ahmedabad. So when I showed you that map, the importance of Ahmedabad was not only as a fabric printing center, it's also because in 62, the National Institute of Design gets established in Ahmedabad. And this has much to do with how Maneklal's life and work shapes up. So in the early years at the NID, almost till the 80s, so from the 60s to the 80s, a lot of visitors came from all over the world to the Design Institute. There was a huge interest in documenting crafts, just like that colonial genre that I mentioned. And there were ethnologists who came from Switzerland, so Swiss anthropologists and ethnologists. There were British anthropologists, textile curators. All of them moved through Ahmedabad and ended up visiting Pethapur and interacting with Maneklal. So here's another layer of his international interaction. And that becomes possible because Pethapur is close to Ahmedabad, and Ahmedabad has the National Institute of Design. So some of it is happenstance, but it also shapes his aesthetic and the way he looks at the world. So in 75, his blocks are collected into the permanent collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is one which was collected a little bit later by the Baroda Museum. Oh, it says London, sorry, it's a typo. But see, it's called Washington no Drishya. It's a representation of Washington. You can see the buildings which are familiar to all of us, the tourists, people taking pictures. It's a very detailed kind of illustrative block. And he begins to challenge already our understanding of block prints. How he made this, where he got the base drawing, these are some things which we've not been able to piece together. And it's also a good time to tell you that none of the prints are dated, so we are doing design history without chronology, and that's a big challenge in our work. in trying to explore what the adjective modern might mean, I'm trying to explore how he presents himself. So you have a craftsman who's thinking of himself as an individual, not as a part of a caste or a trade. And the presentation of self becomes very, very important. This is a letterhead, it's actually a bill book from 1978. And you can see he's calling himself Mistri Maneklal Trikamlal Bibawala. And he says he's a wooden printing block maker and a textile designer. So his persona is one of someone who designs textiles. And why I'm making a bit of a point of it, he also writes below, if you can read Gujarati, it says design, full print, six items, design border, 8 of them, design buta, 3 of them. So he's calling them designs, right? So he's incorporating into his vocabulary this very modern world in trying to describe both the objects he makes and his own idea of his profession. He gets, that was from 1978. He gets the National Award in 1979 for this design that he makes, which has, it's a 6 or 7 color block, and it's got elephants and parrots. He says that I made a traditional design and I got the National Award. You can also see that he knows what the government wants, what is its conception of tradition, and he is able to give it to them just like he would give to other clients what they want. I spoke to you as a tall man, almost 6 feet tall. He is towering over Neelam Sanjeeva Reddy in the presentation ceremony. He's a very impressive figure. So this is the national award that he gets, and is that Jagruti Ben? Namaste. This is Maneklal's daughter, Jagruti Ben. I'm so delighted that she can be here today. So, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay writes a book in 1980 called India's Craft Tradition, in which she's trying to argue for what is master craftsmanship. And basically she derives it from ancient texts of the 5th and 7th century, the development of the Shilpa Shastras, and each citation stresses, oh, by the way, the image is from Manasara, which is a Shilpa Shastra from the 13th, 14th century. They develop this ancient image of craft, and we'll see how Maneklal's career actually militates against this ancientness. So each citation stresses the contribution of the winner through his adherence and faithful devotion to the great tradition of master craftsmanship. So master craftsman is one who is adhering and faithfully devoted to the great tradition, and the great tradition is derived from Mohenjo-daro, Harappa onwards through Gupta, Mauryas, and Jain and Buddhist art, and all the treatises and texts that are written in medieval to early modern times, right? So against this conception of craft is where we need to look at Maneklal's work and see how he knows what they want, and in order to get the national award, and his actual work or the rest of his work is a total explosion of other things. So after the national award, again, the whole idea of presentation of self, on his visiting card, he writes national award winner. He writes he's displayed in Indian museums and abroad. Even the Post and Telegraph receipt that he writes, he puts his name as national awardee with quite a decorative typeface. His letterhead and bill book also change, and these accolades are celebrated in all the instruments, very modern instruments of business that he fashions for himself. You can see a 5-digit phone number. So little village like Pethapur, he gets a phone, it's the old time 5-digit number, and it's kind of celebrated on his letterhead. And that's something that we'll see again and again. In 1997-98, he gets the Ravi Shankar Rawal Award, which is a kind of Gujarat level important award. And in the brochure for the award, we can see what is the company he's keeping. It says something about him, it also says something about the state of Gujarat. So this prestige, patronage, the idea of the state in how it sees its creative practitioners is quite revealing here. So 2 years before him, 3 years, Jagan Mehta gets the award, and he's a photographer. He's a contemporary photographer. Dashrath Patel, you may have heard the name, is a designer. So he gets it in 95, 96. Then 96, 97 is Kanti Bhai Patel, who's a sculptor. So a photographer, a designer, a sculptor, who is famous for all the Gandhi images in Gujarat and in other places. Then it's Maneklal Gajjar, block engraver, and Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh, who's a Baroda painter. So there's a painter, a designer, a sculptor, a photographer, and Maneklal is keeping this kind of company. So you can see that in the fine arts, Lalit Kala, what is the conception of the state when they are giving out its award? It's a very broad canvas of creative production which they are honoring. So it says something about the broad vision of the state of Gujarat also. So when that award comes, he adds that into his visiting card and his letterhead. So he's fashioning himself in a very conscious, self-reflexive way. He also knows the importance of registering all these accolades, which are richly deserved. As I will show you now, we'll take a look at his work. And just to show how conscious he is of exactly what he's doing, none of this is happening by chance, it is self-fashioning. And he says in this film of 2005, which is made by Sarika Parmar, who's of the Gujarat Vidyapeeth, he says, I thought I should make a traditional design without foreign influence, and I got the national award for that design. But what is his approach and attitude towards this thing called tradition? He says young people should keep learning new and modern things, but it is from the old that the knowledge of the modern is acquired. What our forebears discovered is not wrong or irrelevant. If you pay deep attention to their knowledge, you will be able to produce something new. So the way I understand it, he's thinking about tradition as a resource to be modern. That is, the movement has to be towards responding to the present, but not repeating things of the past. But the training and the insights you get from the past is the resource for being modern. And that's something which he says very, very clearly in this film. So this is what we kind of associate with traditional prints, right? These bootas, the all over prints, you can see at the bottom, the peacock. These are some things, I mean, you might be also having kurtas and shirts with these prints. And they are, we'd like to look at whether they are traditional or whether they are even Indian, you know. There's a lot of circulation going on, as I'll show you. So some of us, even through the project, the top two are prints of Maneklal's blocks. The bottom two are my kurtas. So in my own life, I was wearing the prints that Maneklal was also carving. So how contemporary, what we call tradition is also kind of reminded again and again. You can, if you pay some attention, you can see how good his line is, how he distributes form and the spaces in between. He's quite the master. Then he begins a whole series of contemporizing Saudagiri fabrics, motifs for Indian markets. So the Saudagiri trade, which starts in about the 1850s, is affected by the Second World War, and it kind of recedes and stops altogether by the 1940s, 45 or so on. So now you have this resource of Saudagiri motifs, which he starts enlarging and contemporizing them for dress materials and saris and so on. So he's already working with his own inheritances in order to become relevant to the present. There's a whole set of blocks which are luxury textiles rendered in block prints, and we have this idea that perhaps this democratizes luxury textiles. It makes them available because bandhani is expensive, patola is expensive, ikat is expensive, but once it's rendered in block print, it becomes accessible to a lot more people. These raises questions about public taste. It raises questions about the printers and the traders of block printed fabrics also. But you can see in the bandhani example how he tries to replicate the fine lines of the bleeding in bandhani tie-dye in block. That means you need to know your teak wood really well in order to make those bleed lines. So the kind of attention to detail even in reproducing these fabrics is quite astounding. And this circle is about 3 inches diameter. So really, really fine work. So there are adaptations of the Kashmir shawl, of Baluchari motifs, and Jamdani. So these are all luxury textiles from different parts of India, and the motifs are rendered in block prints. If you will remember the Baluchari, it will come up later and you will see how it travels. He does a whole series of chinoiserie prints of these kimono type clad women. You can see all the pagoda-like structures. What kind of fabric is he adapting here? So he renders it as an all-over print for a sari. For the body of the sari, he also makes borders which are integral to the structure of a sari. And below you can see these embroidered Parsi garas, which were saris which Parsi women made, which was embroidered in Chinese embroidery, made in China when the Parsis were very prominent in the opium trade with China. So these, again, this is also a luxury textile because embroidered velvets and satins are not really affordable, and he renders them in block print. These are complex 6-7 color blocks, not easy to make, not easy to print. So a bit of his expertise and his great skill is also visible here, not just the exotic nature of the visual, which is also nice to enjoy. Then there's a whole series of European motifs. So we know Mother Goose nursery rhymes, right? There's Mary, Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow? There is Mary had a little lamb which goes missing. There's Tom, Tom, the piper's son, who runs away with a pig. You know, so these are kind of done in this border kind of fashion, and we can only think about who is using these fabrics, what's happening, what are the markets. See the Easter bunnies with the mother bunny with small young ones. More of that. This is a detail of an all-over print with puppets and letters of the alphabet. So it points to, we think of an urban middle class, probably Bombay, Ahmedabad markets, where a whole new idea of childhood is also being fashioned, you know, through these fabrics which are probably used for clothes or for furnishings, bed sheets, curtains, and so on. There are also these Laura Ashley type prints, many of them, which are peppered in the collections. Between those sheets of Soviet Nari, we find all of these things which we are trying to categorize in some manner to make sense of them. Then we can see how he keeps accounts. The one on the left is his client, one of the most prolific clients called Ronak, which is a boutique in Bombay. And these are the jobs he's done for them in one particular month, and the records that he keeps of the blocks that he makes for them. On the right is the daily diary he keeps. So we know how much he spent for milk and how much he pays daily wages to his carver assistants. So to be quite candid, we have 30 years of account books, but we have not been able to really look at all of them and try to see what's happening there. We've been working on this project for about 18 months or so, and we've been able to see only about 20 or 30% of the material because it's so voluminous. So, we think of things as archives, like a collection of documents, but it's actually a life that is lived, So we have to keep reminding ourselves that these are not pieces of paper, it's a life, and that keeps shifting the emphasis, and that being objective and being subjective, being involved and appreciating the person keeps coming back to us. We showed you the visiting cards and the letterheads. He makes bespoke files with his name. He has stationery envelopes, large envelopes to post all his materials. So he's really fashioning a kind of corporate identity around himself. Then in 81, he travels to Belgium. This is a copy of his passport. Actually, that's where we came to know that he's almost 6 feet tall. We thought he was tall, but we actually know he was 5 feet 11.5 inches or something. Yeah. So some more what we might call traditional Indian prints, all familiar to us in the many garments that we may have worn. But in that series, he starts doing figurative blocks, right? Celebrations of rural Gujarat, spinning, weaving. Look also at the way he does, his color sense is also quite fabulous. This is a wonderful series. It's an all-over print with many kinds of activities of a rural setting, agriculture, the well and ploughing and so on. Again, complex blocks, at least 5 or 6 colors. That means each color block has to be carved separately, right? And they all have to mesh together. So you can also see examples of modernizing India, the dam, Howrah Bridge, and other temples, the ghats of Varanasi. And this watercolory effect that he's trying. So these are prints that Maneklal keeps before dispatching the blocks to the person who has ordered. It's a kind of record for himself, and he shows this to other clients when he has to solicit more work. So it sort of functions as a sample book also. He says in one of the films, there are about 6 films that we have of him, mostly made for Doordarshan and some for the Sarabhai Foundation, which runs the Calico Museum of Textiles. And he says that as a child he loved drawing. And he also goes on to say that to make a good block, it's not enough to be a skillful carver. You have to draw well. And some of these blocks really show us how well he drew and what a sense of form and movement he is able to bring to his blocks. A lot of the designs also came from other people, from the weavers service centers, which were established in Bombay and Ahmedabad, private designers, artists from Baroda and JJ School, and many adaptations from the ephemera that he collected. He collected greeting cards, wedding cards, cuttings from newspapers and magazines to build up his own visual archive, which helped him develop blocks. He also made community-specific motifs. By this I mean there were a whole range of fabrics that are used by specific communities at a particular time of the 20th century. like the Ajrak and Matani Pachedi, which are specific to the Rabari and Jat communities which used Ajrak in the past, and Matani Pachedi, which are the temple cloths of the Wagri community in Gujarat. Of course, now these have moved into popular prints, and there are shirts and trousers and various kinds of contemporary garments. But at some point, these were community-specific motifs. And Maneklal had a long relationship with all the Ajrak printers in Kutch, and with many of these Ajrak printers as well as traders, he had a family relationship. The families interacted. When he gets the national award, the family goes to Delhi, accompanying him for the award ceremony, and the owner of Amber Prints in Delhi hosts the daughters. You went to Agra also, yeah. So and Pethapur Sikri, and so he had this family relationship with Bharat Dyeing and Printing, Amber, which was in Mumbai, Amber Prints in Delhi, with the Kutch Ajrak printers and so on. So we get a glimpse of how craftsmen interact with one another. There is a relationship. It's not only monetary and financial, it's also intimate and cordial. They assist each other. There are letters in which one of the printers from Kutch is saying, your knees pain a lot, use this oil, I'm sending it, take care. This kind of interaction, and that comes as a kind of surprise to us, because all those crafts book that I referred to in the beginning, they don't give us this sense of what may be happening between craftspeople and what is the kind of relationship that they may be having. And you get a rich insight into this from his archives. Another example of this presentation of self, which tempts me to use the word modern, is he writes biodatas from time to time. We have handwritten versions, we have printed versions in both English and Gujarati. And in the biodata, I think you'll be able to read, he's able to present himself in just the way that I have done. I've learnt it actually from him. He tells us how he learnt the hereditary block making training, and how he makes blocks for the Calico Museum. He says one Mr. Charles and Ray Eames of USA visited. These are the people who set up the National Institute of Design. And he casually drops this information in his biodata because it's important that he shows who all he has interacted with. At present, many visitors and artists from USA, Japan, America, UK, France, Thailand, Singapore are to my workshop, purchase wooden blocks and take their, I don't know what he's written there. Then he gets the prizes that he has got, and his visit to Belgium, and that he is in national and international museums. His work is, so he's conscious of these events in his life, and he knows that these need to be projected, and he does it in a way that is very familiar to us. In 89-90, he writes the text for a block carving gallery at the Calico Museum of Textiles in Ahmedabad. If any of you have visited it, the text in this gallery is written by him. It's the first example of a block maker writing an account of his own craft, not another art historian or a craft historian or anybody else. He tells his story. And he writes it, this is an enlargement from a draft biodata. He says, I wrote and given the book Block Making Art to Sarabhai Foundation for publishing as suggestion by Giraben Sarabhai with full details and photos. So it's hand illustrated. It's really a beautiful piece of work. If I had more time, I would show you all this. It will be useful for learning this art and craft for students and others, and therefore the craft will remain alive. So he's able to also formulate what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. And very conscious of his place in history in a way. So talking of history, the work from his studio shows something else also. So there is this whole series of abstract prints that he does. So when we think of Indian block prints, our mind goes to those buttas and booties and elephants and parrots, but this is also very voluminous in his archive. Look at these abstract expressionist. So just like he tries to render that bandhani bleed, he tries to show brush strokes in wood. Okay. Then he does very geometrical, modernist kind of prints, and some of it. Everybody we show this to, and I don't know whether this is a reaction which you also feel, you feel like I could wear this even now, you know. So there is a kind of contemporaneous feeling about these motifs. Look at this one. 3 colors, looking like some Jackson Pollock. And he knows also the kinds of styles he is able to cover. So he says, this is another from a draft biodata. Designs and styles we make: textile art, figure art, abstract art, natural art, art for mud printing, ajrak art for Kutch, traditional art, modern art, and rural art, and special for Saudagiri, etc., of all designs making in wooden engraving, hand printing blocks. Maneklal is trilingual. He writes in Gujarati, he writes in English. He speaks also English pretty well. There is some films that we've seen in which he's taught himself how to write, and writes in Hindi. So he has this trilingual correspondence in his receipt books, correspondence, and bill books. So when he writes in his biodata that visitors from all over the country visit me, he's also careful to kind of retain evidence of this. So we have 8 volumes of visitors' books in which people write when they come to visit him in his workshop. Some of them sketch. This is Gabaji, one of his principal assistants, carving blocks. You can get an idea of the tools, the way they squat over this very low stool when they are carving blocks. We come to know of the designers who visited him, the anthropologists I mentioned earlier, the ethnologist from the Swiss school. Many well-known textile figures come there, as well as large numbers of students from NID, from NIFT, from various places. And they're writing in their own language, like this Japanese visitor. And the image on the right is an entry about 3 months before he passed away, in which he's visited by the assistant director of the Crafts Museum in Delhi. And he writes about how even 3 months before he died, he was explaining his craft and his art in the most vital manner. So he never lost enthusiasm for hosting people and explaining to them. This is one which I particularly want to share with you, a series of prints that he did for a sari, which we call the Bombay series. Those of you who have lived in Bombay and enjoy Bombay, you'll enjoy seeing the Gateway of India, Rajabai Tower, the Municipal Corporation building. We have in the archives some evidence of how he actually made these designs. This is for that Bharat dyeing and printing works. This sari, we believe, was ordered by a boutique called Malabar, which was in the Taj Hotel in near the Gateway of India. This is again a 6-7 color block with the sites, popular sites of Bombay. It's done as a border and it's done as an all-over print also. And I just did some enlargements for you to see the kind of detail that he is able to capture. The size is about the size of an A4 sheet. So you can get an idea of the scale of it. And this is the lower part. Okay, now very quickly. So we see the development drawings for VT station, for example. You can see how he's sketching, but where does he get the images? We think he's got them from picture postcards of the late 19th century, early 20th century. You can see Crawford Market and how it is rendered as a block. So the chances of these kinds of sources being used are pretty good. Then there are old 19th century photographs of Bombay. Here, this is Hanging Garden, which we can see how it's adapted. Then he does one of the Kamala Nehru Park in near Hanging Gardens. This is that famous shoe house, another 7-color block. Some detail. And another adapted from the Air India timetable and fare schedule, the brochure covers. So you can see the kinds of sources that he's using. This is also been done for Bharat Dyeing and Printing Works. We found out just last week. You can also see how he's adapting some of the figures. If you look very carefully, perhaps we don't have the time for that, so I'll race ahead. Then because of NID being close by in Ahmedabad, you have a lot of graduates from the National Institute of Design who went to him as students. Then when they start their private practice, they start ordering blocks from him. So he's introduced to this modernist textile print, kind of Marimekko type influence, that visual language also. So those dancing girls we saw the Bombay series, and then he's doing these kinds of very graphic prints also. This is another nice one. We are not able to find out whose work this is, but also done for Bharat Dyeing and Printing Works. But it's likely that it came from Malabar, which was run by a Mrs. Hamilton. So a lot of these kinds of treatments he kind of gets introduced to through these kinds of clients. Then there's an interesting phase when Gurjari is set up. You know, Gurjari, the emporium for Gujarati crafts. There is a waning market for the Ajrak printers, and they try to bring them new products. And these prints were developed in the 1970s. They are actually contemporary prints, but today they are called traditional Gujarati prints. So it's almost as if tradition is a series of moderns, you know, series of contemporaries, which when you look back becomes traditional. But at some point, and this is in even our living memory, it is a modern innovation, has nothing to do with anything which is going on in Kutch, but a sensibility which comes from a design school. He's in the media. There are articles about him. We've got at least 16 or 17 of these, and it's also listed in his biodata. In Femina, this is a very important Gujarati journal called Kumar. You can see that his national award winning block is featured there. There are 6 films that we have of him, and this gives you an idea of what his studio looked like. These boutique owners, the second row, left hand side, there's a series of boutique owners who kind of emerge in the 70s and 80s who start ordering prints. So they are a very important client who shape public taste and also his own appreciation of block prints. We see some images of young girls carving blocks. Maneklal again broke with tradition and taught his daughters, he had 3 daughters, one of whom is with us, how to carve blocks. Though this was not known as such in Pethapur. We see him writing his books of accounts, and also we get a glimpse of his personality, how he played the radio in his workshop, and they carved to Hindi and Gujarati songs on the radio. Last of all, this is the last section, is about the circulation of motifs. This is a letter we found from the Central Cottage Industries Corporation of India in New Delhi. Maya Johar is writing to him saying, I'm going to be coming to Ahmedabad, I'd like to see the Saudagiri prints. And she says, please do not give our blocks and designs to other parties till I've met you and discussed in detail. I just want to talk about the circulation of prints and the ideas of copyright and plagiarism. So this is a print that Maneklal does for Maya Johar. She does a Jamawar collection of saris. Okay, each of these lozenges, as they are called, is about 2 inches high, maybe 1.5 inches. Okay, and then we find it in a very important, influential English designer, Susan Collier and Sarah Campbell, who did this print, called it Alhambra, and they made it for Liberty and Company in 1969. And they say in the description, this is their archive of 50 years, they say this is an example of an all-over pattern being used within a border, a playful reference to a traditional Indian theme. And just by chance, I find this on the Kashmir Shawl book of John Irwin, where he's given credit to it to the Calico Museum of Textiles. And this is the shawl fragment from the Calico Textile Museum, which is an exact reproduction of what Collier Campbell do and also what Maneklal does. So you have these kinds of sources which are adapted by multiple people and they are circulating across continents. We don't know exactly how these are moving, but they are moving. They are mobile kind of cultural artifacts. And also raises questions about who's copying from whom, is there something like copying, is it plagiarism, and so on. And there's no firm answer to this. I met a block printer in Bombay who says, Ben, ama kai copyright jevu hotu j nathi. That is, in block printing, there's nothing like copyright. So we are constantly adapting and borrowing from all kinds of material which is with us. But another kind is happening in this book called Indian Textile Prints, edited by a person called Pepin van Rooyen. It's a Dutch publisher which does this book called Indian Textile Prints. You see that baluchari which I showed you several slides ago. It's all of Maneklal's work, bound in a volume, which he says anybody can use to make wrapping paper or any private use, but if you do professional use, the copyright lies with this Dutch publisher. There's no mention of Maneklal, nothing. He's also reproduced some of the less stereotyped ideas of Indian textile prints, and that's also quite striking. Then Maneklal himself adapts William Morris. So on the left is Maneklal's block of William Morris's honeysuckle. So how does this happen? So there are some kind of gaps in our understanding. We are not able to trace exactly who is the client and how do these materials go. But all the block printers in Bombay have a huge collection of books. So they have William Morris books, books on the Topkapi Palace, Jackson Pollock. So this is a kind of resource which is ever present and is being adapted. Just to say one last thing, we found in the collection Maneklal's spectacles, and we also found a prescription from 1962 which says the power of his lenses was -12, and it goes on to 15, and then one of his daughters told me it was 20 a little bit later. So it also says this kind of profusion of prints, this kind of wonderful visual output comes at what kind of a price, this is work, this is livelihood, it's an occupation, and there's a body which is involved in the production of all this material, and it kind of makes us wonder how these kinds of aspects can be brought back when we write about crafts and craftsmanship and individual craftsmen, to see at what price and what are the other hidden aspects, and visibilize them in some manner when we return to our scholarship on crafts, on design, and the kinds of relationships between these two. And that in the Indian context, these are not kind of separate spaces of cultural production, but they are actually porous and kind of mutually nourishing. So with that, I'll leave the presentation and ask you to bring up questions which you feel may cover the gaps in this work. Okay.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. I know this work is still very recent and very immediate, but I think you've given us a really wonderful sort of sense of some of the directions that you've taken the work in and some of the challenges and some of the sort of questions that this work raises. I think there's also a really interesting connection you said towards the end about, in terms of the traditional as a sort of history of the modern, which connects nicely with Kamya Sharma's work in the first talk that we had in the series, so direct you back to that. I came to know Suchitra's work through an article that you wrote 12 years ago. Just as I was sort of also getting interested in design and design history, and this article was sort of looking at design history as a sort of discipline or a practice specifically with the within an Indian context. And you said at the beginning of the talk that I think you said I was transformed by the archive. So I'm sort of curious. You come from a design background. You're a design historian, and you're looking at a sort of archive, a collection, which sort of sits within sort of craft history, or seemingly sits within craft history. So I'm curious about how this sort of design history approach and background for you, how you bring that to the work that you're doing on Maneklal Gajjar, and a consideration of craft.
So, to be very honest, and I'll answer this in a personal kind of way. So craft studies, as we were exposed to in the National Institute of Design, was much like this Kamala Devi, how she writes in her book about this great Indian tradition and crafts people who are upholders of this heritage. Almost kind of placing them backwards in time, And I happened to read this anthropologist Johannes Fabian, who talks about the denial of coevalness, in the sense that what he's trying to say is that anthropological writing denies the subject entry into present time. We always place them in the past. And that is something that I had internalized. And it's the archive which compelled me to re-look at this material. It was almost as if Maneklal was saying, I do not belong in the 15th century. I'm here today in the 20th and 21st century. So consider me like that. Like, don't be surprised with my biodata and my letterhead. You have it, I have it too. So this, almost like he is demanding coevalness. So I think design history enables that kind of a transformation. For me, that was personal. It comes from anthropology, and design history does borrow from it's multidisciplinary. And so because of that the work I read of this anthropologist, it gave me a framework in which I could feel emotionally, but I could put a term to it, So I think design history compels you to leave behind some of these formulae, the formulaic approach of craft studies. I think people might critique me for saying this quite so strongly, but yeah, this is how it touched me, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. And we're going to open up to audience questions as well, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. So I'll ask one more, and then we can kind of turn to the audience, and we can always come back to a few more questions as well. So one of the things that I pointed out in the introduction, and we've kind of stated quite directly in the original introduction to the series, is this sort of interest, or rather kind of a challenge to design histories which have focused on particularly famous designers, famous, well-known institutions, and we've sort of challenged that a little bit with our introduction to think about a kind of broader focus and why that's important. And we're seeing an increased interest, I think, in design, particularly in the art world as well at the moment, and in gallery spaces as well. We've recently had work on Ritin Mazumdar's work by the art historian Rishmita Sahu as well. So we have this idea of sort of certain design histories around famous designers, institutions, but I'm also interested in having looked at an individual block carver, what are the opportunities that you found in looking at an individual and in his life and work in this collection?
See, in many ways, he is a singular personality, so we cannot, and he's also in Western India, and he's also near the National Institute of Design. It's a very particular kind of career. It throws light on the National Institute of Design, actually, so it's like if you do this kind of craft history, it throws light on design history in a strange way. It also challenges the idea that these two are separate. They are sort of contiguous, they bleed into one another. And it's through the individual that we get these insights. I think looking at an individual's life history gives us this opportunity, which perhaps I'm also working in the archives of the National Institute of Design. You don't find any references to Maneklal in quite this way. So this work sort of fills gaps in the other domain, it seems, and it kind of, for me, it feels like these two are not separate. So let's stop doing that separation, is what the archive tells you. I don't know if it answers your question.
No, I think that's a good place to pause, see if there's any questions from the audience, and we can, fantastic.
Yeah, you just have to come. Okay, then I will probably not.
Or maybe this can go around and we can share a mic. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, how would you place this individual as are you looking at him as an outlier amongst a lot of craftsmen? Or are you looking at a game changer in which he brought about a whole lot of ways of doing things that was adopted by other people in the fraternity? Or would you even look at him as a clever entrepreneur who kind of knew what was happening and was able to not play the game, but something like that. He knew what was happening.
He was very strategic, yeah.
So how would you look at it from a historical perspective? Is the outlier that you don't see individuals like that in that space?
So no, I don't think he was an outlier, because since and through the process of making inquiries in Pethapur and meeting his associates who have slowly started opening up, I don't think he was an outlier. We began by thinking he's an exceptional, singular human being, and he is. No, I wouldn't for a moment take away from that. But as I was saying, it's a very Gujarati story. And you have a region of India which has a long history of trade and business. And it has seeped into many communities, not just the trading castes and communities. So I'm beginning to think that this is a Gujarati story, and we have to look at it in the social history context of Gujarat. Your second question was he... So I suspect we will find many such people. I've already found printers from Bharat Dyeing and Printing, which did the Bombay series. We found a younger printer who then leaves and forms Ronak, whose account books I found. they are also like this. You know, so there is a kind of verve to do new things. So innovation is in their genes, bloodstream, in their attitude. So it's just taken for granted. They are not engaging with the idea of tradition at all, whatever the national award says. Their own sense is that they are making the new, you know. So in that sense, they are not outliers. I think we need a re-questioning of this whole notion of craft and craftsmanship, especially in Western India. I'm not saying it's the same in Bastar or in Murshidabad or something. We'll need to make this kind of inquiry to find out how far this goes. So they are entrepreneurial as a way of life because they are in Western India. So I'm adding many caveats so that I hesitate to generalize it across the subcontinent. Because they are engaging with technology, engaging with the textile mills, they always have one eye on new developments in other spheres and connecting with it. There's also a unique story of the Baroda princely state, which plays a role. You already have Dr. T.K. Gajjar at the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century. He already has a doctorate. So he belonged to a community which is it has a certain historical trajectory, and you have to locate him in his context. So I wouldn't say all craftsmen are like that, but many craftsmen in Western India are likely to be there. So he may not be an outlier in Western India, but he will be if you can compare it to a craftsman in Bastar, perhaps. So, and it also reminds me all the time as a researcher that why are you so surprised? Because I'm talking to myself, that if you have a notion of this is what craftspeople are like, they are in a small village, it's my researcher bias which makes me so surprised that he's an entrepreneur, he's strategic. He is that because all people are like that, you know. So it makes you think about your own preconceptions when you start, because also I've been trained in a design institute. So I come with some frameworks which need heavy dismantling. So in that sense, it's also me. But he is also because training your daughters to carve blocks, these are not common. So he is extraordinary in some senses. But he's also part of his times and his region. So there is a bit of both, is how I feel now in retrospect. I was very overwhelmed in the process of inquiring into his life. I was totally bowled over and so on. But I'm also a historian of Gujarat. So now I see that it is also contextual and quite natural, you know, that he should be like this.
So anyway, just one comment. Could then this be a methodology for studying craft history that you seem to mention? That most clusters would have individuals like this. It's just that we haven't gone there and talked to them to figure out who changed the narrative a bit, who was innovative, who stepped out, who spoke to individuals way beyond whatever the cluster was. Could this then give us a methodology for us to study other clusters as well? While you are saying that it's very regional and specific to Gujarat, but I have a feeling that it could give us a methodology for us to go look at other clusters and bring up more bottom-up kind of narratives of what really happened by looking at outliers like this.
Yeah, methodologies and attitudes. So for example, when I worked on the Banaras brocades and talked to weavers in Banaras, they would keep asking me, आप हमको पुरानी चीज़ क्यों पूछ रहे हैं? आप ये पूछिए कि हम नया क्या बना सकते हैं? So we also keep asking for those paisley prints, those cypress trees and those Mughalized designs. These are the prints that are chosen for Festival of India fabric displays. There's a reification of a certain narrow production from all the crafts. So the the Balucharis will have to have those hookah smoking zamindars, which I showed you. So there's a kind of stereotyping in which historians, media people, all the articles talk about Saudagiri. Not one shows the Bombay series. Why is that? So the films, the media, they're all playing a role in narrowing our idea of craft. And most of all, the national awards. So the form he fills out, Maneklal, it asks who did you learn this from, this craft, what texts do you know? So he writes Shilp Shastra and all this. So they compel you to fall into a certain notion of craft and then award you. And he knows that. So he says, I made a traditional design and gave it to them. While all the time he is making Washington No Drishya. Can you give national award to that Washington No Drishya? Which is quite brilliant, I thought. So there is a kind of, so that's why I was saying, craft studies is tied up with national identity and heritage. And if you mess with that, it messes many important. So if your scholarship reveals these new aspects, what will happen to national identity? Right? It'll rock. Little bit of an earthquake will start there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
talk.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What's the significance of Saudagiri prints? As in, why is it important textile from the Saudagiri block print? Is that any different from any of the block prints? Why is that?
So Saudagiri is different because it's extremely fine. Those prints that I showed you, those kinds of in a square grid, the grid size is 3 mm, 4 mm. So really tiny, fine work. So it's prized because of that fineness. It also derives from patola. I mean, I didn't go into all of that. It's a kind of mimicking of patola. It also connects to the fustat fragments that they found in Cairo in the 14th century, which was from the 14th century. So there's a lot of interchange in those motifs, but it's prized because of it, the fineness of the work. Saudagiri, Sauda means trade. Saudagiri textile is trade textiles. It was not worn locally. It was, all went to Southeast Asia, to Thailand, Cambodia, then onwards to Indonesia and so on. And then actually in the Second World War, there is a bit of a Swadeshi movement there. They decide, we are going to make this, we don't want this from India. And they start developing capabilities. Here the Second World War interrupts the Indian Ocean trade. So it sort of dies down. And here they start modifying it for local markets.
So it's still produced today, this kind of...
So at the moment there is no Saudagiri revival, but a few years ago, yes, you could get saris and you could get dress materials, and maybe in another 2-3 years you'll see it again. So this is also cyclical, it's ever valuable. So that's why these sample books of these parats which we saw, the block prints, they are like, they'll keep coming back again and again. So I had those Baluchari kurtas I showed you, and I'm sure if you look, you'll also remember, very similar things that you had. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am. You have covered very well.
Yeah.
And here we are seeing the NID, Development Company Handicrafts, and all private people also there.
Yeah.
Calico Museum is there. All their support is there. How the future of craft, how we'll see. Whether crafts will develop, whether craft needs some aspects of interference, or how we can see the future of craft, especially the block making. And second question, whether you compared the Maneklal's work with the Andhra and other state block making, any difference, how it is and all that.
Okay. I'll answer it in the opposite sequence. I have not looked at other block printing crafts. That almari I showed you with all the materials, we've been able to look at only 1/3 of it. So in 18 months, we've looked at a small fraction and tried to make sense of it. So I haven't got even to anywhere outside the almaris, right? So that's one aspect. So no, I have not looked at others, but I have tried to look at block printing in Bombay because that was the closest professional connection that Maneklal had. What is the future of block prints? It is affected, or it is being modified by digital printing. Before that, there was screen printing. The textile mills were a big competitor already for block prints. So in what forms it will survive, it's very hard to say. But the craftsmen themselves may move to digital printing and take it on in a new way, because we find that craftsmen are ever ready to adapt technologies. It is some of us who tell them to keep doing by hand and so on, and prize the handmade, right? But the market has got a huge appetite for novelty. So to feed that appetite for novelty and new prints, I wouldn't be surprised if they take over all the technologies. Already Maneklal himself was making designs for screen printing. So he was quite versatile and flexible, alert, anticipating changes. A lot of the Gajjar young people have become computer engineers and doctors and lawyers and everything else. So we may not have a category in quite the same way, you know. So yeah, it will survive because the need for ornamentation doesn't become out of fashion. So it will take some other form.
Yeah, one more question. You are referring about a national award. They are asking for whether Silp Shastra, this thing, that thing. You propose any suggestions to improve on that?
Not at the moment, no. But I know that also needs revisiting.
Yeah,
you know, it's because the practice is totally challenging those criteria, you know. So yeah, but someone needs to look at it. Not yet me.
Someone to suggest to the development commissioner, so that we can make an effort to change it.
Yeah, but it will also then affect national identity. So I don't know how this is going to happen. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's just to come back to your point about technology as well, and the question about future craft. And I'm not a craft historian, so I don't know how widespread this is. But I've heard of sort of machine carving being used to test out blocks now, until a sort of design is finalized, and then being handed over for a block to be carved by hand as well. So I think that's something that, as I said, I don't know how widespread that is, or if that's something that you've come across.
So I wish Mala was here, because in COVID, when she couldn't get blocks carved, she and her team began to carve on styrofoam. So they made saris and quick blocks by carving with a cutter and knife on styrofoam. So already COVID made it impossible for us to go to the block carver, right? So many sorts of situations like this have resulted in innovations. And yes, we've also heard that laser cutting and so on is being used, even 3D printing. It'll also make a difference to the kinds of dyes that are made, because there's a kind of specific gravity which wood relates well to. So if it's styrofoam, then the dye also consistency has to be changed. And if it's 3D printed, I don't know. Then who will be doing hand printing? There are also machineries, I believe, which can take those blocks and mechanically print it. So this kind of hand effort, we may see some transformation in that also. So it's hard to say how it will go.
Yes, I think there's a question here.
Thank you for your time, and I appreciate this. When you showed his visiting card, there's a motif that he's used. Yeah, so I'm very intrigued, like, where was it his own design, and how did he develop, like, it's ghagra and some animal form.
No, it's a woman.
Oh, it's a woman. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's from Matani Pachedi,
Okay.
which is the temple cloths. It's
Okay.
the female figure from that.
Okay.
Just stylistically, I can say that's what it is. I don't know how he developed it. We don't know many things.
Okay. So it is he who designed that, or
I
was it
I'm
like
guessing.
from a temple carving, or?
don't know, but
Okay.
those figures are used in those temple cloths.
Okay.
So why he picked the female figure, what it was,
Okay.
what it the
Meant.
significance of why
Yeah.
he picked that from many other. We
Yeah,
don't know.
because that stayed like the
Yeah.
whole, and it kind of gives every motive that he has used in one small thing, probably like the curves and the design
Yeah.
and the intricacies.
Yeah.
It has all those things
Yeah.
framed in one thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's from Matani Pachedi.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This question is more to do with my own curiosity of your research. I'm quite interested in knowing what sort of led you to have this emphasis on the presentation of self, which you kept, reiterating on throughout your research process. You also kept, looking at these letterheads and, visiting cards, which is not something that you'd look at when you're looking at a person who's so into who's a textile designer and who's a connoisseur of block printing and deals with a very different part of design itself. And I'm wondering how your research process would have possibly differed if you hadn't seen it with the lens of looking through his personal biodata and as you mentioned you're sort of understanding the life of this person and not just going through his archives. So I'm just curious to understand that.
Yeah, so thanks. I was hoping somebody would, have a question, something like this. So, I was actually crafting the presentation to the title that I had written of The Craftsman as a Modern Man, because I was trying to get into this whole conception of the craftsman as someone belonging to those texts, Shilp Shastra and all of that. Whereas the archive was telling me he's doing Bombay series and Hanging Garden and all sorts of other things. There are many others which are quite astonishing. There are figures of bears and horses with snakes inside their bellies and all sorts of things. So he's not that kind of a craftsman, who is quoting Shilp Shastra or anything like that. So how does one bring some layers, some depth into this idea? Because he's, as Sir said, he's entrepreneurial, he's strategic, he knows how to handle his publics, right? So, and I've been looking at the letterheads and those bespoke stationery that he has and so on. These are very modern, contemporary things. Like if I set up a company, I'm going to do all these things. Because of that craftsmanship framework, we don't expect him to do it, but he's doing it. He's saying, put me in the 20th century, right? So, and all the other craft books are talking about how it is carved. All the films show him only carving. All the magazine articles. How is that? So, this part which is leaping up from the archive, I was just trying to put that in front of us and ask ourselves, how does it change our idea of crafts and craftsmanship? I think it does. To me, it did. Maybe it did to you also a little bit. So that's why I was focusing on this presentation of self, because the understanding of the self and self-consciousness and self-reflexivity is one of the hallmarks of the modern mind. Otherwise, you think of yourself as a part of a community, a caste. You have a community identity. You don't have an individual identity. So I was trying to explore that little space and trying to show how he moves away from this repertoire which we think is of traditional Indian. He's doing all sorts of things, as you saw.
He does a lot of that buta and veil and jal and everything. He does. It's not like he doesn't do. But he's each time breaking away and doing this new thing. So I was trying to concentrate on all that because it challenges our notion of crafts and craftsmanship for that very reason. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll have to call out time, but we'll step outside as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
For your talk. Thank you for joining us, and a quick plug that we have more series, have more talks throughout the series this year, and the previous ones are also online, so please do join us again. Thank you.